Welcome to the Bill Cartwright Show with our special guest, cannabis and travel hospitality consultant, Brian Applegarth. Brian, welcome to the show.
Bill, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
We do have a common history because we did used to be neighbors years and years ago. Your family, my family, up in El Dorado Hills. But let's go back to that. I want everybody to get to know you quickly. Let's
Sure.
talk about where you grew up and talk about your family.
Sure. Yeah, born and raised in San Jose initially, and then my family moved up to El Dorado Hills, as you mentioned, which is a suburb of Sacramento, kind of in the foothills on the way up to Tahoe. And when we moved there, it was a pretty small town. I think it was about 10,000 people, and it's changed a lot. So, yeah, I'd say, a lot of my formative years were in San Jose, very diverse kind of city type feel, or more urban. And then by the time I was in fourth grade, I was up in El Dorado Hills in a more rural setting. And that was obviously a very different experience. And yeah, born and raised NorCal, and then ended up going to college down in Southern California, down in Irvine at UC Irvine. So, but yeah, Northern California pretty much.
Now, how did you end up, well, how and why you end up going to Irvine, and what did you learn from there? And then after that, what was your first job?
Yeah, I ended up going to Irvine because my parents, they were pretty kind of adamant and I guess encouraging about attending a UC. So when I was applying to colleges, I applied to a handful, and UC Irvine felt like a fit, and went there and studied international relations, international studies, specialized in cross-cultural communication and conflict resolution, specifically for the Americas. You had like a regional focus and then kind of a discipline. And then after I graduated from UC Irvine, I decided to go live abroad, and I went and lived in Japan. Um, Started teaching English over there as my first job out of college, and
Hold it, where'd you been?
I lived in Osaka for about a year and a half.
Osaka.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, fantastic experience.
And you taught English over there? Now, did you speak Japanese?
I think that's probably a that's probably overstating it. I studied very diligently when I was there, and I kind of call it survival language. I could travel and find the right platform for the train and order food, and ask where the bathroom is, and so very functional. Japan's it's a fascinating and complex language. So I wouldn't say I spoke it, but I think I could get by. I could get by and kind of live there.
So how long were you in Japan?
So total in Japan, I probably spent about a year, maybe almost probably a year and a half to 2 years of my life. I've spent in Japan, either living, working, and or traveling. So that's yeah, it was a great experience. Really, my goal when I graduated university was to start learning languages, and kind of had the idea that I wanted to work in international politics in some way, perhaps the UN. And that was my first attempt at that, was to kind of go start learning languages and kind of be on that trajectory, which ended up changing. But yeah, Japan was about a year and a half to 2 years, and then directly after that, I moved to Italy for about a year and a half, and spent about a year and a half or 2 years of my life over in Italy. So those two countries specifically, I spent a good amount of time. Also lived in Barcelona for about 4 to 6 months. So really when I was younger, when I was a younger man, I was really into just traveling and living abroad, and experiencing different cultures and ways people lived. And, I just I still find it fascinating how many different ways there are to, live and be in different places. So very much part of my past.
So where did you head to from Italy?
So from Italy, I moved to Nashville. That was kind of that turn, of course.
That's a turn.
It was a turn. Yeah. Yeah. Part of my experience, actually in Japan is when it started. I've always loved music and singing and song. I got into songwriting. So, I decided to move to Nashville and pursue a career in songwriting, which kind of led to some singing, some demo work, and working in the music industry. So I spent a good chunk of my kind of 20s living in Nashville, Tennessee, and also touring. So I ended up performing quite a bit for about 2 years from coast to coast, playing in a country music act. And so that was a whole phase of my life where I was kind of seeking out this career as a songwriter in music. And it was a great experience. It was interesting because I got to see a lot of the US. I had done a lot of international travel up to that point, and then the music really afforded me to kind of explore the United States and play in different venues and clubs and theaters and things like that, festival.
Hey, talk about that real quick. How many different bands were you in, and what were the names of them? And then tell me about some super cool groups maybe you guys played with and saw.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when it started, it was just me playing writers' rooms, like Nashville's got a whole scene of just people that write songs and play them out. And they're kind of songwriter circles where you tell the story behind the song and you play an original song. And kind of the dream there is to get a song picked up by an artist who then records it, and you start on the path of being a paid songwriter. So there was that, and then I ended up being part of a kind of a group called Curtis with a K, and it was three. We kind of had three frontmen. I did more of the lead vocals and kind of the rhythm guitar, and of course songwriting with my partners, my other kind of bandmates. And there were two other guys, Eric and Sean, and we had about a 5 or 6 piece band, depending on the venue and the gig and the pay and all the things that come into play on that. Um, and then after a year or two of that, it moved into more of a duo act called Curtis and Lucky, and it was like a Brooks and Dunn type thing. And we played we put out a few songs. We got some charting and some charts that are exciting for up and coming acts. Nothing big and crazy, but and we got to open up for a lot of great acts. Opened up for Little Big Town and Joe Nichols. And in Texas, one of the biggest crowds we played for was this artist Randy Rogers, who's Texans know him for sure. It was a pretty big audience, about 15,000. That was the largest crowd ever. Um, but yeah, Easton Corbin, there's a lot of just country acts that some of them are still mainstays and well known, and others kind of had a passing fad of, being very popular. And so it was great. We played a lot of the best clubs in the US, some great festivals. And also became really aware of how the music of the business of the music industry, right, is a very different animal, and also all the travel and the toll that takes on kind of like your life and your body. And so it was a wonderful phase of my life, but eventually I was ready to move on and kind of go in a different direction. But Nashville and music was definitely a core part of my 20s and early 30s.
So I'm gonna give you two things. What's the two hardest things about being a writer and a musician?
Oh, I mean, in my journey, it
Yeah.
was it was honestly, it went from being a love and a passion to a business. And I think looking back, I was when I first entered the country music scene, I was very much more in the folk kind of James Taylor, I'd say 70s era singer-songwriter was my authentic kind of art form and myself. I also liked writing a lot of mid tempos and ballads and more kind of poetic lyrics. And the more I was in Nashville and in the music industry, when it started becoming a business, it was all about, what's the look, what's the up tempo, the song can only be 3 minutes. It has to be simple. People have to sing along. So you start getting all these, it goes from being this love of music and art and creativity that is an expression of yourself authentically and I think maybe I was too young. I just wasn't there maturity wise, but I started kind of pivoting really hard into trying to accommodate what I was told I had to do. And in hindsight, I think that was the hardest part for me is it became something that, when I put the guitar down and stopped doing music, I didn't touch it for like years because I was just so, I think, emotionally and physically exhausted from the experience a little bit. And
Yeah.
so I think that was the hardest part is taking something you love that's an art form and trying to turn it into a business and kind of the negative impacts of that and how it changes your relationship and how you relate to that passion that I had as a younger man, before I pursued a course in music as a career.
Okay. So where did you go from Nashville?
Oh man. So from Nashville, I decided I want to be close back to family again. So I moved back to Northern California, Sacramento area, and started working in real estate, being closer to family, and eventually landed down in the Bay. Moved to Oakland, and then eventually Sonoma County. So basically, jumped around Northern California a bit. Did new home sales, real estate for a few years. Wasn't very fulfilling. So I ended up, well, part of the story is what segues into what I do now is when I came back to California in 2013, I was in this new home building industry for a few years, kind of scratching my head saying, what's the next, how old am I and what are my skills and what can I do as a career that will be more fulfilling? And about that same time is when I started realizing that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of cannabis shops that had evolved and were part of California. And that I had no awareness that even happened when I was gone, traveling and doing music and living abroad. And so when I came back to California, that was a very kind of surprising discovery. And that was part of that when I was kind of self-assessing of what are my skills and where's my knowledge and what makes me happy and where can I kind of focus my career, from here forward. Um, Travel was definitely one of them. Real estate, I had a good knowledge base there. Music, had some experience there. Of course, the international study stuff that I did in academically. And this new burgeoning, interesting cannabis landscape, I just found fascinating. And so that's when I started researching it. And something that really rose to the surface was this intersection of travel and tourism, which I'm very passionate about, the power of that and experiencing other cultures and that intersection with cannabis as a tourism experience, coming out of prohibition. And for me, I felt like the more that I looked into the cannabis scene in California, I felt like the writing was on the wall, like it was going to go, it's going to continue to legalize, and it is. So I was in really early, and in 2013, 2014 is when I kind of pivoted and started focusing on unpacking and innovating the modern day kind of cannabis tourism and travel landscape and trend.
So talk about that. What kind of depth is that? Does that go into, and what market is that? Um, I, as you know, I'm back at the University of San Francisco. Does that apply to young people? Does that apply? Is there an age group? How do we identify
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, and there's a lot to dig into because, just I think some historical context is good. And then I'll jump into where it is today. So part of my journey was starting to really study like what is cannabis? Like I had used it casually in high school and college, but I didn't have a deep relationship with it, never grown it, this and that. So I started researching the history of cannabis and became really infatuated with it because it's got a long history, um, starting in different cultures around the world. There's a handful of regions that are kind of the original regions where cannabis grew wild. And one of the first travel stories with cannabis is the Silk Road, where people would trade cannabis, and it was used in many ways, medically, spiritually, fiber. I mean, it's incredible the amount of applications the plant has, right? And let's also acknowledge that cannabis and hemp, it's the same plant. I mean, today we talk about it in two different buckets, but it's a highly evolved plant species at the end of the day, from medicine to textiles, and beyond. So the more I started studying the history of cannabis, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Like down to the biological like science behind it. Human beings, animals, we all have systems within our body, that are called the endocannabinoid system, and it's like your reproductive system or your immune system, and or your skeletal system. And this system was discovered in like the early 90s, I believe, in Israel. And there's a lot of receptors in your brain, in your gut, that are part of your endocannabinoid system. And the fascinating part about it to me was the cannabis and hemp plant, the therapeutic compounds, the CBD, the THC, the CBN. There's hundreds of these therapeutic compounds in this plant, and they directly dock on these receptors in our body. So they literally the communication, and they call it a lock and key system, where these therapeutic compounds, we literally co-evolved consuming this plant, and biologically the human body and the endocannabinoid system works directly with this plant. Um, even if we put the cannabis and hemp plant totally aside, this endocannabinoid system internally works. We produce two endogenous or endocannabinoids that work with these receptors. And then when you ingest the plant, hemp or cannabis, you put more of those therapeutic compounds in your body, and it works with these receptors. So from a very biological basic level, I said, this is really interesting. The more I looked into it, you learn that cannabis was part of the US Medical Pharmacopoeia Journal from 1850 to 1941. Yeah, cannabis tinctures and bottles were part of the medical pharmacopoeia. And you used to be able to, in the early 19th century, Americans across the US could buy cannabis, in pharmacies. It was readily available as a medicine. And it wasn't removed until 1941, a few years after Prohibition. So when you start studying the medical history of cannabis, I was like, there's something deeper here. And then you start getting this context that it's been less than 100 years that cannabis has been illegal and uh, removed from access, right, for patients or anyone. So, um, anyways, all that I found really fascinating. So I started going down kind of this cannabis rabbit hole. And the things that stuck out to me was there's some beautiful travel stories, like tying this back into travel is you have the Silk Road. You also had this phenomenon happen in the 1970s, 60s called the hippie trail, where hippies would go travel this overland adventure through Nepal and Pakistan and different India, different places where, cannabis had a long history, and there were different varietals or cultivars. And these hippies would bring back the cannabis seeds to California. And basically, it was this adventure, but cannabis was part of it. And Northern California specifically became a very robust kind of genetic seed bank because of this phenomenon of travel, this hippie trail travel. Um, so, the more I looked into it, I'm like, this is really interesting. And then I started going to all these dispensaries that were in 2013, 2014. I started peeking my head in, and then I went and got a medical card, and started visiting as many different dispensaries as possible. So with me, it wasn't really about going. I mean, I would go and I would try products and things, but it wasn't about going to the same shop every day. It was more about what is out there, what exists, and what does this new kind of experience mean for travel. Like if we look at the wine industry, for example, it's got vineyards and it's got barreling and it has wine tasting rooms and it's all of these things. It's so what is if you're looking at the future of cannabis, what does that mean as this becomes increasingly normal? And it's not just cannabis flower or hashish or whatever. We move into beverage and culinary and spa and topicals. And so I saw the more I learned about cannabis, the more I realized the extension of what this next evolutionary period was going to be for the cannabis and hemp plant in mainstream society. Um, so I kept digging in, and it was, not to tie this back really quick to the music thing. I've been very cautious about making sure that I don't kill my love for travel because I didn't want to do the same thing I did with music. So I've not that I've done it perfectly, but I've tried to be very measured about how I approach this and where I allow myself to go because I definitely don't want to have that kind of repeated pattern. So yeah, I mean, so what does it mean today? I mean, it's fascinating. Cannabis transcends pretty much every vertical of travel because of its flexibility and what it represents. So at the very basic level, I'd start with, hemp sustainability, replacing plastics, literally having a more regenerative, renewable resource approach. Hempcrete is another example of this. Hemp can turn into about 50,000 different products that are non-consumable and incredibly sustainable. To the point where the United Nations actually is looking at hemp as one of the key tools to reach the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals that have been kind of cast down from the UN. And then from there, it goes into leisure travel, medical travel, groups, meetings, and conferences, right? It's an industry. So you're like, where are they going to have the conventions and who's going to be setting up the booths and what hotels are they going to be staying? So you start looking at how cannabis as an industry and how that intersects with the global travel economy and all the different players, right? Airports, rental car companies, attractions. It goes on and on and on. So how does hemp and cannabis start integrating into the mainstream global travel economy? And the first kind of 10 years of my work, really the first 6, 7, were largely just being an educator and working in data with the travel industry and starting to profile and understand the cannabis travel audience, which is a very specific audience that the travel industry looks at this through that lens. And the audience today is about 72 million Americans. And it spans across generations from baby boomers down to Gen Zs. And it spans from medical travel to leisure travel to meetings, groups, conferences, events. It really kind of touches all that. So it's a very kind of wide conversation.
You talk about that specifically, the medical travel.
Mhm.
That's for guys like me who are all beat up. How's that gonna make my travel better?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways. I mean, one is, you know, there we saw in 1996 when cannabis was legalized in California, there was an era of medical travel that started where people were traveling to California to try to use cannabis or figure out how it could help their quality of life or treat their ailments. Um, and all kinds of patients. I mean, there's all kinds of patients from people, with seizures, it goes on and on, pain relief, sleep, So as far as, let's just say you're talking in terms of chronic pain with your knees and hips and things, I think the first one is actually planning a trip specifically around that, where you find one of the leading experts, you go to a place where they have safe tested cannabis medicines and topicals and tinctures with internal and external application. And then you spend a few weeks or a week or a month working with an educated professional, medical professional, directly treating this and trying to figure out, like, that is the purpose of your trip, is to work with somebody knowledgeable to be able to try different products to improve your quality of life. And I think that's the most pure form of like basing a trip around it. I think that also, once you have that knowledge and those products, it's, how do you travel with it and how do you utilize it to improve your travel experience, to mitigate your pain so you could, go on that walk to that temple in Japan or whatever it is. And this is where travel comes into play too, because, traveling across international borders or even state borders is risky, quite frankly. It's
Yeah.
so you got to know what you can travel with and when, because it's confusing, between the basic rule of thumb is anything hemp, CBD or CBN, anything that's hemp and non-psychoactive that doesn't have that high or that altering effect and is hemp product, typically you're good, right? And then if you have more of a cannabis product, which is a different industry, different supply chain, different regulations, different legalities, that's got a different set of laws. So, and this is part of the confusion where I help the travel industry understand kind of what this means and how to promote public safety, and communicate to the visitors and the visitor economy stakeholders.
So that's really interesting because I'm not I don't want to feel high, but I
Mm-hmm.
do. I think I'm probably your average Joe. I just want to feel really good. So
Yep.
whether it's some CBD oil or some gummies or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
so you recommend going into the shop and just checking out and see what's best for you.
Yeah, and I think going into the correct shop, there's so many different shops today. Um, because again, cannabis and hemp are very wide ranging. So some shops are much more medicinal minded. Um, some shops really promote what we call full spectrum or holistic medicine or holistic formulations, where you have all of the therapeutic benefits working together, um, which is a concept called the entourage effect. And then there's other shops where you'll find more products that are made from what the industry refers to as distillate, which is like an isolated compound. And the general rule of thumb is that isolated just doesn't have the same kind of holistic approach as a full spectrum product. So, like if you get a topical bill, you definitely want to make sure it's broad spectrum or full spectrum. So you have that all of those different synergistic therapeutic properties working in concert together, because it's the research shows that the efficacy behind those kind of products are more pure and true. And you got to be careful, because in this market where it's this coming into legalization still, and they might legalize it at the federal level in some form. And there's chatter right now that this might happen this year, where they legalize it to a Schedule 3 drug, which is like basically a pharmaceutical, instead of an illegal Schedule 1, which is like higher than fentanyl, I think right now. Cannabis is still. So obviously it's not reflective of, I think, the truth, and they're considering rescheduling that because a recommendation was made. So I would look at a cannabis shops and cannabis lounges and look for people that really overinvest on education and supporting people to, understand what the product options are and why they can help your quality of life. Um, and then it's experimentation, where you have to try it and also be consistent with trying it, for give it a shot. That means more than one time. You could probably feel some great relief if you use it once, but consistently using products and journaling and understanding how they're working for you. When you talk about the fear of being kind of over altered or high, the good news is that this industry is completely maturing. You have a lot of products that are in that microdose level. So if you take a little bit of THC as part of that full spectrum product formulation, and I'm talking between 1 milligram and 2.5 milligrams, like something very small where you're not going to feel high, but you're going to feel better. You might even feel a little happier, but you're not going to feel high, right? When you start feeling high, so you have the microdose state, which is kind of that very small amount of THC. And then the next step up from there, at least the way that I teach it, is this concept called flow state, where you're a little bit more elevated. And then from there, it can get into higher doses of being high and things like that, or going journeying is another like interesting conversation. But for your profile of what you're interested in, it's really doing either broad spectrum with no THC or doing very trace amounts of THC, like 1 milligram or up to about 2.5 milligrams. And I think playing in that space first, starting with 1 milligram of THC, is where you could really potentially unlock a new tool where you feel very comfortable being able to take a mint or to be able to feel better from a consumption point of view. And then with topicals, you could really use topicals that have you're not going to get high from like topicals, and having a good amount of THC in there is very therapeutically beneficial. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an attorney, so full disclosure, just someone who researches, but the understanding is that cannabis can be extremely anti-inflammatory, and the systemic cause of a lot of ailments is inflammation. So when you put a really kind of condensed and potent cannabis topical on your knee, it could have, amazing therapeutic, pain relieving effects. And this is large. I mean, a lot of people point to the anti-inflammatory properties of cannabis.
Nice. Okay, so what's our age group? I mean, when I was a young whippersnapper, I could just keep going and didn't care. So, um, is it 30s, 40s? We know when you get past that, you're beat to hell. So, so what's our age group?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's I mean, the data shows that this is being, cannabis and hemp are being consumed, by every demographic. So it's really, even up to the silent generation, which was I've been doing data and research on the cannabis travel audience since about 2019. So being able to understand these generational cohorts is pretty interesting. From a travel perspective, um, approximately 70% of Gen Zs are picking their travel experiences and destinations based on being able to access and have at least one cannabis experience while on vacation. And that's significant because that's a very high percentage, right? Where you're looking at these younger generations who are choosing cannabis for their consumption interests and travel experience interests. Um, when it comes to consumers, millennials and Gen Xers are also strong consumers. Baby boomers are like the fastest growing demographic, to your point, because people are figuring out that cannabis is now a really interesting option for improving quality of life from a pain relief point of view. Also, there's been a large influx of non-inhalation products. For example, Pabst Blue Ribbon, the beer company, they have, I think, the highest selling cannabis beverage in California, and they're in dispensaries throughout the whole state.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, another
Blue ribbon.
Pabst Blue Ribbon. Yeah, they have. Yeah, and they have one of the beverages they have, Bill, is a nighttime beverage that helps you sleep. So it's like this is where cannabis gets really interesting because what used to maybe be a shot of grappa or like a nightcap, with cannabis, you have these new verticals, these new categories of beverage that are happening, that are really interesting. This can also come in the form of tea. Like there's cannabis tea that has an abundance of what the therapeutic property is CBN that is associated with this kind of good night's sleep. So, you have your sleepy time tea, but now you have this infused with hemp or cannabis because cannabis is just a flowering plant, right? It's just another herb. So it's really kind of interesting. Another well-known beer company that is involved is Lagunitas. They have a beverage called Hi-Fi Hops that is also right there alongside Pabst Blue Ribbon in all these dispensaries throughout California. So you're starting to really see a lot of ingredients, like even brown sugar and butter and ghee, and I'm constantly really impressed by just the flexibility of what this plant can do. I mean, you see people using cannabis. They have cannabis lubricants. They have cannabis suppositories for prostate health. There's sublinguals, tinctures. It goes on and on and on. And this is why it's so exciting. And also, it takes a lot of education because not most people, but a good amount still, when they think of cannabis, they think of reefer madness, they think of smoking, they think of getting high, they think of those common, because when they prohibited cannabis in 1937, it basically means you can't do research, right? It like stops down everything. So, this is a whole new conversation with research and data. And one of the most important parts about the new legal cannabis industry is when you go into a dispensary shop, you're purchasing products that went through a supply chain with a very strict testing tier. So it tested for heavy metals and molds and mildew and things like that would taint a product. So that's one of the best benefits of purchasing from these legal cannabis dispensary lounges and shops and places is that the product has been through a lab and been tested for quality and purity.
A big thing for seniors now is, especially for me, is not only physically, but just having really good circulation.
Mhm.
So your body's pumping. Does cannabis have anything that way?
I think what comes to mind when you bring this up is there is a whole niche within the cannabis space where cannabis, specifically those microdose and flow states, um, are associated with a kind of activity or health and wellness activities, right? So there's people that consume cannabis that profess that cannabis is a way to help you kind of sink into a workout and get a really good workout as an enhancement tool in that way, or do yoga or meditation or like things like this. And there's a whole community that subscribes to that and believes in that. And it's people that lift weights, it's people that go cycling. Um, and they use cannabis as a place to be present and to get into this kind of state of flow. I mentioned that flow state kind of phrase, and there are two examples that people talk about. And I believe I don't know the depths of it, but I believe that there's actually scientific and brain activity that demonstrates this as well. That when people talk about flow state, they talk about with basketball when you're kind of in the zone, when you're just like in this state where you can't miss a shot and you're just kind of feeling it and you're in this very unique kind of space where everything feels a little bit more accessible and very present, and the hoop is clean, and you're able to just perform at a high level. Also, another example of this in athletics is the runner's high. that people talk about. When you start going and you kind of get past a certain place where you're in, people attribute that to kind of this flow state concept where you get in this kind of hypnotic state where you're able to perform in a really powerful way. I think it's a really interesting concept. I'd like to study more about the actual science and the brain activity behind that story between those kind of three things, like cannabis being a facilitator of flow state in relationship to being in the zone or a runner's high. But there is a healthy dialogue around how cannabis is part of that conversation and can play a role in that. So yeah.
Because of this stigma that's out there, are there any like big groups like AARP or any senior centers that support hemp or cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, there's a doctor out of Sonoma County called Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather, and he's been studying cannabis as a treatment for Alzheimer's and dementia for, I want to say, about 30 years now. Um, so that comes to mind. You have a handful of senior groups that are popping up. Like you have these specific cannabis brands and groups that are tailored to people that are in kind of that baby boomer, 55 and up active adult type phase of life and how cannabis can help them. One of them is called Senior High that I've heard about. Also Rossmore, which is a huge 55 and up community in Walnut Creek. I went and spoke at that about, God, 6 years ago. And it was full. At least a couple hundred people there to learn about the endocannabinoid system and, how cannabis can improve quality of life for them. So yeah, I'd say there's probably something in your backyard and somebody in your community that is leading this conversation. The quality I've seen kind of ranges. Some people have different areas of passion and what they focus on. And, the people that got into this have different motivational values. I mean, that's been a really interesting thing to witness is, you know, an industry coming out of the gray market as like a legal medical compassionate use era into full recreational adult use legalization. From an industry growth standpoint, it's really fascinating to watch the people and the players that come to the table and what the motivating factors are behind it. It's in a lot of ways, it's kind of a magnifying glass on society, and it's really interesting. But going back to your question, there is a huge movement with that demographic, with the baby boomers, the seniors, and I would encourage you to look in your own backyard. And there are doctors too that are specializing in kind of this specific niche of supporting. A lot of people, say that this demographic is where you really have the ability for cannabis to come in to uplift your quality of life in that stretch of years. And this also goes hand in hand with, replacing alcohol. Honestly, it's like people are, they don't want to wake up hungover anymore, and people feel the toll that alcohol takes on their body as they age. And cannabis has as long as you know how to use it and you're using it with intention and you're using it in small amounts. I mean, one of the phrases we always say is go low and go slow. If you're using activated THC that's going to make you feel altered, even if it's just a little bit, like 1 milligram, just go low and go slow and give it time. If you're eating it or drinking it, give it time to set in before you take more. And just to put that into context, in California, one dose of cannabis can be 10 milligrams, and that's legal, which I think is too high personally. I mean, but also my tolerance is really low. So when I tell you to start with 1 milligram or consider starting with 1 milligram, that's 1/10 of what the state of California allows in each mint if you wanted to. So I just feel like 10 milligrams for the average new mainstream consumer is just too much. You're going to feel high. So I would recommend anybody who's approaching it and they're really looking to have it in an applicable way, ongoing, that makes them just feel better, but it's not disruptive to their day-to-day life. right there in the 1 to 2.5 milligram range is where you should experiment and journal and figure out what your kind of optimal dose is.
Well, Brian, I want to thank you so much for being on. Um, I do think this is something that's amazing, especially as I get older and trying to maintain my level and my health it's really really important to have those options. So, but thank you very much. We got to visit a little bit. Maybe I could sneak out your way and hang out a little bit. I'm definitely my wife's definitely looking to kick me out of the house. So
Yeah, yeah, please do. Where I live, there's a handful of lounges and shops, and I can give you the personal pain relief tour, and we can do some experimenting out here. And I appreciate you having me on, Bill. It's so good to see you and catch up, and like really enjoyed the conversation. And you're welcome anytime out here. It'd be great to see you in person.
awesome, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.